She didn't cheat. She didn't scream. She didn't break anything. She didn't even slam the door. She just slowly stopped caring. And the terrifying part? He didn't notice. Not at first. Most men don't lose women to other men. They lose them to emotional distance, to silence that should have been a conversation, to comfort that quietly replaced connection. This is not a story about betrayal. It is a story about something far more dangerous, a slow, invisible erosion that most men never see coming until it is already over. Today, we are going to examine the quiet moment that respect begins to shift, what it looks like, what triggers it, and why intelligent, hardworking men are blindsided by it every single day. Stay with this, because what you are about to hear may change how you see every relationship you have ever been in. Michael didn't notice the exact day Ashley stopped looking at him the same way. There wasn't a fight, no dramatic confession, no slammed doors. It was quieter than that. It was the moment she corrected him in front of their friends and didn't glance back to see how it landed. It was the night he explained how exhausted he felt from work, and she responded with silence that felt more like evaluation than empathy. For men between 25 and 44, respect rarely disappears in an explosion. It shifts in small, almost invisible exchanges. And when it shifts, everything else follows. The laughter feels thinner. The touch feels optional. The loyalty that once felt assumed begins to feel conditional. What most men never realize is that the quiet moment respect begins to move is also the moment emotional safety starts negotiating its exit. Michael was 36, steady career, disciplined, the kind of man who believed showing up consistently was the same as being a good partner. Ashley was 34, ambitious, socially aware, and constantly absorbing messages about self-growth and emotional standards from podcasts, social feeds, and group chats. They weren't toxic. They weren't reckless. They were modern. They split bills. They discussed boundaries. They posted curated vacation photos. From the outside, they represented progress. Inside the relationship, though, something subtle had started to change. Michael felt at first as distance, but he couldn't explain it without sounding insecure. Ashley felt it as disappointment, but she couldn't articulate it without sounding critical. And so neither said what they actually meant. Instead, they adjusted their tone, their timing, their eye contact. And in those micro-adjustments, respect began recalibrating. Did Michael miss the early signals? Was this about attraction fading or something deeper? Something about emotional safety that neither of them had a clear language for? Was Ashley's rising professional confidence reshaping what she needed from the relationship? Or had Michael's consistent silence around his own discomfort slowly built a wall he never intended to construct? These are not simple questions, and they don't have simple answers. But they are the questions that sit at the center of what actually happened between these two people. And they are worth examining carefully, because the answers reveal something that applies well beyond Michael and Ashley's story. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michael and Ashley didn't begin as a complicated story. In the beginning, it was simpler than that, and more alive. They met at a mutual friends gathering in their late 20s, the kind of event where nobody expects to meet anyone significant, and then somebody does. Michael noticed Ashley first. Not just her appearance, but the way she held a conversation. She was direct without being aggressive, curious without being intrusive. She had a quality of attention that made the person she was talking to feel genuinely interesting. And Michael, who had spent the better part of his 20s in relationships that felt more like parallel existence than actual partnership, found it immediately disarming. He wasn't looking for anything serious. That's what he told his closest friend James, anyway. But something in the way Ashley asked questions, real questions, the kind that assumed you had something worth hearing, made the usual defenses feel unnecessary. They dated slowly at first. Neither was in a rush. and that unhurried quality gave the early relationship a particular depth. They had real conversations about where they came from, what they were building, what kind of life they each wanted. Michael told James early on that Ashley was the first woman he had been with who made him want to think more carefully about who he was becoming. Not because she pressured him, because her presence raised the standard of what felt worth doing. Ashley told her closest friend Rachel that Michael had a steadiness she hadn't found in previous relationships. Not boring steadiness, but the kind that made her feel like the ground beneath her was reliable, like she could build something real on it. For the first year, that foundation held everything with apparent ease. They supported each other's ambitions. They communicated openly. They made each other laugh in the specific way that only happens between people who are genuinely paying attention to each other. But woven into the fabric of something good were the first threads of what would eventually create distance. Michael's work intensified in the second year. Long hours became routine. His attention, which had once been available and fully present, began carrying a quality of distraction even in moments that were supposed to be shared. He was still there, still reliable, still doing all of the visible things a committed partner does. But the texture of his presence had shifted in ways that were subtle enough to go unremarked and significant enough to be felt. Ashley had oriented herself around the quality of connection they had built in that first year, and she began quietly registering the change without knowing what to do with what she was registering. She didn't raise it immediately. She told herself it was temporary, that the pressure of his work would ease, that the man who had shown up so fully in the beginning was still fully there, just stretched thin by circumstance. She was generous in that interpretation, for longer than she probably should have been. The first real shift happened during a conversation about work. Michael had been passed over for a promotion. He wasn't crushed, but he was tired. He told Ashley he felt overlooked. She listened, nodded, then responded with solutions. Update your resume. Network harder. Maybe you're being too patient. Her words were practical, even logical. But what Michael heard was assessment. He didn't feel understood. He felt measured. In modern relationships, men are told to open up more, to be vulnerable, to communicate. Yet when vulnerability is met with correction instead of containment, something internal tightens. Michael didn't stop talking that night. He just shared less. And that reduction, almost invisible, marked the beginning of his emotional withdrawal. Not because he didn't love Ashley, but because he no longer felt safe landing softly in the relationship. He had reached for something real and received something functional. And the body remembers that, even when the mind tries to rationalize it away. This is one of the more painful patterns in modern American relationships, and it cuts across income levels, education levels, and social backgrounds. Most men are never taught, with any real clarity or depth, how to ask for emotional presence without feeling like they are asking for something they should not need. They are taught to be reliable, to provide, to solve. And when they finally lower the wall enough to say, "I am tired, I feel overlooked, I need something from you right now," and what comes back is a list of action items rather than a moment of genuine contact, something closes. Not permanently, not consciously, but something recalibrates. Michael had spent years building a life that demonstrated his value through output. What he needed in that moment could not be measured in output, and neither of them had the language yet for what that gap actually cost. They continued forward as though nothing had shifted, but something had, and both of them, at some level beneath the daily routine, already knew it. Ashley, on the other hand, didn't see herself as dismissive. She saw herself as motivating. She believed partnership meant pushing each other toward higher standards. In her mind, respect meant growth. If Michael stayed stagnant, she feared she would outgrow him. This fear wasn't malicious. It was cultural. Women in their 30s are constantly absorbing messages about not settling, about demanding emotional intelligence, about seeking alignment. Ashley had internalized those messages deeply. So when Michael expressed doubt, She interpreted it as weakness rather than temporary fatigue. The shift wasn't loud. It appeared in subtle sarcasm, in playful jabs about ambition, in comparing him to more driven men in her circle. Each comment was small enough to dismiss individually, but repeated often enough, they formed a pattern. And patterns quietly redefine how partners see each other, not in a single moment of clarity, but in the slow accumulation of impressions that eventually become a fixed internal image neither person consciously chose. Respect in modern relationships is rarely about dominance. It is about perception. Michael began to sense that Ashley's perception of him was shifting. She interrupted him more. She questioned his decisions in front of others. She fact-checked his stories mid-sentence at dinner with friends. None of it was dramatic enough to justify confrontation. Yet each instance left a residue. For many men, respect is intimately tied to being trusted in their competence. When that trust feels unstable, they don't usually protest loudly. They adapt. They become more reserved, more watchful. Michael stopped sharing half-formed ideas. He avoided debates. He chose peace over presence. From Ashley's perspective, he seemed less engaged, less assertive. Ironically, the very behaviors that had eroded his sense of respect were now being interpreted as evidence that her doubts were valid. The cycle deepened without either of them understanding what was driving it. Each was responding rationally to what they were experiencing. Each response was making things worse. That phrase Michael repeated to himself, "It's easier to stay quiet," deserves more attention than it usually gets. It is the internal language of a man who has learned to associate emotional expression with escalation, for whom the act of naming a feeling carries an implicit risk of conflict or misinterpretation. And so the feeling doesn't get named. It gets compressed. It goes into the same internal space where previous unaddressed moments have been accumulating without resolution. This compression does not eliminate the feeling. It pressurizes it. And pressurized feelings have a way of expressing themselves indirectly. Through irritability, through low-grade distance, through a disengagement that a perceptive partner cannot help but notice even when they cannot identify its source. Ashley noticed. She couldn't have pointed to the exact moment it began, but she felt the atmosphere shift. She felt the warmth in his presence cooling into something more functional, more managed, more careful. The man who had once made her feel like the most important thing in the room had started to feel like someone managing a situation. Phones made everything more complex. Evenings that once held real conversation were now filled with parallel scrolling. Ashley consumed content about emotional standards and high-value dynamics. Michael absorbed financial advice and productivity content. Both were learning, but neither was translating what they learned into shared dialogue. Instead, comparisons formed silently on both sides. Ashley saw men online planning thoughtful gestures and wondered why Michael's efforts had started to feel routine. Michael saw highlight reels of men being openly admired by their partners and wondered privately whether Ashley still felt that way about him. Social media didn't create their tension. It amplified what was already present. It provided a constant stream of curated reference points that made ordinary relationship fluctuations feel like personal deficits. When respect is unconsciously measured against performances designed for an audience, real life begins to feel insufficient. And insufficiency, when it goes unspoken between two people who still share a bed and a lease and a future plan, becomes a particular kind of quiet poison. And that is when something shifted that Michael would not fully understand until much later. The loyalty question entered the relationship through a door neither of them had anticipated. Ashley reconnected with an old friend, Daniel, through social media. It was harmless at first. Casual messages. Shared memories from years earlier. Michael noticed, but said nothing. He trusted her. Yet he also sensed a new lightness in her tone when she was on her phone in the evenings. Not romantic, but attentive in a way that felt different. For men navigating modern relationships, Loyalty isn't only about physical boundaries. It is about where emotional investment lives. When a partner's most relaxed, most engaged, most openly appreciative attention begins flowing consistently outside the relationship, even innocently, it exposes cracks that already existed inside it. Ashley didn't cross any lines, but she did compare. Daniel complimented her ambition. He asked about her projects with genuine curiosity. He validated her stress without immediately offering solutions. And Michael, unaware of the specific content of those exchanges, continued assuming stability while the emotional atmosphere around him was quietly shifting. The breaking point wasn't explosive. It was a dinner with a larger group of friends. Daniel happened to be there. Ashley laughed freely at his stories. She touched his arm briefly while emphasizing a point. Michael observed quietly from across the table and said nothing, which had by now become his default. Nothing inappropriate occurred. Yet something crystallized in him that evening that the previous months of accumulated tension had not quite managed to bring into focus. He didn't feel jealous in a theatrical sense. He felt replaced in tone. The ease Ashley displayed, the lightness, the full unguarded engagement, the warmth she extended without calculation, reminded him with uncomfortable precision of how she used to respond to him. Not to Daniel, to him. That recognition didn't trigger confrontation. It triggered something quieter and harder to manage, clarity. Respect had moved, not fully gone, but no longer anchored in the place it had once lived. And once a man senses he is no longer the primary recipient of the specific quality of attention his partner once reserved for him, something fundamental changes in how he occupies the relationship. That night, Michael didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He lay awake with something more uncomfortable than anger, the particular weight of honest self-examination arriving later than it should have. He asked himself whether he had become too comfortable, too focused on external markers of success, while the interior life of the relationship quietly hollowed out, too emotionally restrained in the moments that required presence rather than productivity. He recognized, with the slow clarity that only arrives when the noise of daily routine goes quiet, that he had retreated repeatedly rather than addressing discomfort when it was still small enough to address without a crisis. He had chosen peace over honesty so many times that peace had stopped meaning anything. He had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of connection. And in doing so, he had allowed a gap to widen that his own silence had helped create. This is the thing about emotional withdrawal that most men don't fully reckon with until it is late. It does not feel like a choice in the moment. It feels like wisdom, like maturity, like not making things worse. And by the time a man understands that the silence was making things worse all along, the distance it created has already done its work. Ashley confronted him gently a few days after the dinner. She asked whether he was unhappy. He responded carefully, measuring every word so as not to escalate, which was itself evidence of how far the dynamic had traveled from where it started. He told her he had been feeling corrected often, evaluated more than embraced, less admired than assessed. Ashley was genuinely surprised. She insisted she respected him deeply. But when she paused to identify a recent moment in which she had expressed that admiration directly and without qualification, the silence between her attempts was longer than either of them expected. She respected his role. She respected his consistency. She was no longer certain she respected his presence in the way that presence actually requires. Not conditionally, not comparatively, not with a quiet asterisk attached. Hearing her struggle to find the example, Michael felt the specific exposure of having a fear confirmed by the person whose perception matters most. He had sensed the recalibration. He had hoped he was misreading it. He was not. But was this really about respect in the conventional sense? Or was it about something far more layered? Was it about who Michael and Ashley had each quietly become inside the relationship, and what each of them had allowed to accumulate in silence rather than address with honesty. That question matters, because the answer changes everything about how what happened next should be understood. Modern relationships often confuse compatibility with chemistry and chemistry with respect, and in doing so they allow a critical distinction to go unexamined. Michael and Ashley were compatible. They aligned on values, finances, long-term goals. They were, by most external measurements, well matched. Yet somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary days, respect had become conditional on performance. When Michael thrived professionally, Ashley's warmth expanded. When he plateaued, she analyzed. When Ashley felt validated externally, she was present and warm. When she felt internally insecure, that insecurity found its exit through critique. Neither was villainous. Both were human, but without conscious awareness of what was happening. Their dynamic had begun operating on subtle power fluctuations rather than mutual emotional security. And subtle power fluctuations, when they become the ground on which a relationship stands, do not feel like struggle. They feel like the relationship simply becoming less than it once was, flatter, more functional, less alive, without either person being able to explain exactly when that happened or why. Let us be precise about what was actually happening beneath the surface. The red herrings first, because they matter. This was not primarily about the Daniel situation. Daniel was a symptom, not a source. He represented the emotional validation that Ashley was not consistently finding inside the relationship, but he did not create the deficit. It was not primarily about Michael's career plateau either. Ashley's concern about his ambition was real, but it was layered over something more fundamental, the loss of felt admiration. And it was not simply a communication failure in the conventional sense. They were talking. Words were being exchanged. The problem was that neither person felt genuinely received by the other. The words were landing without the emotional contact that makes communication actually function as intimacy. You can have every conversation and still not close the distance if neither person feels truly met on the other side of it. What the psychology of modern relationships reveals about dynamics like theirs is both clarifying and uncomfortable in equal measure. There is a pattern that emerges when one partner repeatedly reaches for emotional contact and finds the response just slightly insufficient. Not cruel, not absent, just consistently short of what genuine presence requires. Over time, that partner develops what functions as protective self-sufficiency. They stop anticipating full receipt of what they offer. They redirect their deeper emotional investment elsewhere, to friendships, to work, to the version of themselves that exists independently of the relationship. They become impressively self-contained. And from the outside, that self-containment looks like confidence, like a person doing well. What it actually represents, in the context of a relationship that was supposed to hold both people, is the beginning of emotional departure. The relationship remains structurally intact. The investment has already begun relocating beneath the surface. This is why these shifts feel sudden to the partner who did not initiate them. They are never sudden. They are the late, visible expression of an internal process that has been running quietly for months. And here is the part that sits at the core of what actually caused the erosion. The part that is hardest to sit with because it distributes accountability without offering the comfort of a clear villain. The recalibration of respect is not primarily about resentment. It is about adjustment. Ashley was not punishing Michael. She was not strategically withdrawing admiration to teach him a lesson. She was doing something far more involuntary, updating her internal model of what this relationship was and what she could realistically expect from it, adjusting her emotional investment to match the emotional return she was consistently receiving. This is not calculation. This is self-protection. This is the psyche doing exactly what it is designed to do when the gap between what is needed and what is provided becomes a pattern rather than an exception. And Michael, on his side, was doing something equally involuntary, contracting his emotional exposure to match the level of safety he actually felt. Both of them were operating rationally within the environment the relationship had become. Neither had consciously chosen to create that environment. Both had contributed to building it, one small, unaddressed moment at a time. There is a particular kind of loneliness that exists inside relationships that look functional from the outside. It is not the loneliness of abandonment. It is not the loneliness of open conflict. It is the loneliness of being next to someone who is present in every practical sense and unreachable in the one sense that would actually matter. It is the loneliness of reaching for real contact and receiving politeness instead. Michael felt it most acutely on the evenings when he and Ashley sat in the same room and the silence between them contained nothing warm. Ashley felt it in the mornings when she woke up next to someone reliable and felt, without being able to fully explain it, that she was still somehow alone. Both of them were living inside the same invisible gap. Neither had named it. And unnamed things have a way of growing in the dark until the space they occupy becomes too large to keep pretending it isn't there. The revelation came not through crisis, but through a conversation that the dinner had finally made unavoidable. Michael said the thing he had been carrying for months. He said it simply, without performance. I don't feel like you look at me the same way you used to. No accusation in the tone. No theater of injury. Just an honest observation from a man who had finally concluded that the cost of continued silence was higher than the risk of being wrong. Ashley's instinct was to deny it. But something in the directness of how he said it moved past her defenses in a way that the previous months of careful, managed conversation had not. She admitted she had been questioning things internally. Not his loyalty, not his fundamental character, his direction, his emotional presence. Whether the version of him she was living with was still in motion, or whether it had settled into a form she had already fully accounted for and stopped being curious about. Hearing that, Michael felt the specific weight of a quiet fear confirmed. But he also felt, beneath the difficulty of it, something that had been absent from the relationship for longer than either of them had acknowledged, the sensation of actually being in the same conversation at the same time. This is the core truth that their story surfaces, and it is worth holding clearly. Respect does not shift because love ends. It shifts because the felt experience of being truly seen, of having your presence received as something genuinely worth choosing, not from habit or obligation, but because of who you actually are right now, becomes inconsistent. Attraction does not disappear in a single moment. It recalibrates across dozens of small moments that nobody marks at the time, but that accumulate into a shift that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. And loyalty, the real kind, the kind that holds under pressure and remains chosen rather than assumed, is emotional before it is physical. It lives in whether two people feel safe enough to remain honest with each other about what they are actually experiencing. When that safety erodes, everything built above it begins to feel less certain. Not because either person stopped caring, but because caring, alone, is not enough to sustain a relationship that has lost the honesty that allows caring to actually land. What Michael and Ashley experienced follows a pattern that plays out in modern relationships with a consistency that is uncomfortable to examine but impossible to ignore once you have seen it clearly. I call it the emotional erosion pattern. It moves through 4 distinct stages, and understanding those stages is what separates the people who can recognize and interrupt this dynamic from the people who only fully understand it after it has already run its course. Stage 1 is subtle admiration decline. This is where it begins, not with conflict, not with a defining event, but with the quiet softening of how one partner sees the other. Curiosity is replaced by familiarity. The specific quality of attention that made the early relationship feel alive starts operating on assumption rather than active investment. Nothing appears wrong in any visible sense. but something has stopped being tended to. Stage 2 is emotional safety withdrawal. One or both partners begin self-editing. The vulnerable conversations, the half-formed thoughts, the moments of genuine uncertainty, they stop being offered because experience has taught that the landing will not be quite safe enough. The relationship continues functioning on the surface. The real interior life of each person starts conducting itself elsewhere, in friendships, in work, in the private thoughts that never quite make it into the shared space. Stage 3 is respect recalibration. This is the pivot point. The internal model each partner holds of the other begins updating based on accumulated evidence rather than original intention. It is not a conscious decision. It is an involuntary adjustment. Admiration becomes conditional. Presence becomes evaluated rather than received. The relationship is still intact, but it is operating on a different set of terms than either person has clearly acknowledged to the other. Stage 4 is quiet detachment. Both partners remain present in every practical sense, but the emotional investment that once made the relationship feel like the center of gravity has quietly relocated. This is the stage most people mistake for a sudden change. It is never sudden. It has been accumulating through every previous stage, and by the time it becomes undeniable on the surface, it has already been real beneath it for a long time. We began with a quiet moment, a correction in front of friends that nobody addressed, a silence that felt more like evaluation than empathy. Small things, the kind that are easy to dismiss individually and impossible to ignore collectively. Michael and Ashley didn't struggle because they were wrong for each other. They struggled because they had each, in their own way, stopped doing the one thing a real relationship requires above everything else. Staying honest about what they were actually experiencing before that honesty became the only thing left that might have changed something. What their story ultimately reveals is something that extends well beyond their specific circumstances. Respect in a long-term relationship is not a fixed quality assigned at the moment two people commit to each other. It is a living dynamic, influenced continuously by how partners speak to each other, how they listen, where they direct their attention, what they choose to acknowledge, and what they allow to accumulate in silence. Every moment of genuine curiosity reinforces it. Every quiet correction in front of others erodes it. Every instance of full presence, phone down, actually there, actually listening, deposits something real. Every evening of parallel disconnection, every vulnerability met with solutions instead of stillness, every fear compressed instead of spoken, makes a withdrawal. The balance shifts in both directions, incrementally and invisibly, and it is only when someone finally looks at the total that they understand how long the movement has been going and how many ordinary moments contributed to it. For the men watching this, the question worth sitting with is not whether Michael handled things correctly or whether Ashley's expectations were fair. Those questions lead to debates that replace insight with defense. The question worth sitting with is more personal than that. It is whether there are moments in your own relationship or in relationships you have left behind where the atmosphere changed in a way you felt but did not address, where the quality of how you were being seen shifted and you registered it, and you responded by working harder or going quieter instead of going honest, where the distance between you and the person you were building a life with grew not because either of you stopped caring, but because both of you kept choosing the version of the conversation that felt manageable over the one that was real. Those are the moments that accumulate into the shift. Not a single betrayal, not a defining fight, just the long, quiet succession of moments where honesty was available and something easier was chosen instead. The quiet moment respect begins to shift is not the end. It is a signal. And the only question that actually matters when you receive it is whether you are willing to take it seriously before the silence becomes the loudest thing in the room. At what point in this story did something feel familiar to you? Was it the correction that went unaddressed? The vulnerability that was met with solutions instead of presence? The distance that grew so gradually neither person could identify exactly when it started? Leave your answer in the comments. These conversations matter, and the community that is built around this channel exists because men are willing to be honest with each other about what modern relationships actually feel like from the inside. If this video reached you, subscribe to Modern Relationship Mind. This channel exists to give men the psychological clarity to navigate modern love, loyalty, and emotional dynamics with the kind of depth that most conversations on this topic never actually reach. There is more coming, and it goes deeper,